Much of what springs to mind when you say the word sci-fi ultimately derives from physics, and arguably engineering too. Lasers, space travel, energy weapons, robots. All the blinking lights and gunmetal grey is decidedly physicsy. Even if the genre, as it often does, has only the most distant relation to anything actually scientific, the core and foundational tropes the setting and the ideas were based on were chiefly built from the science of physics. Chemistry is less often the crux of a sci-fi plot, but often as or more important as set dressing. Conjure up the image of a mad scientist, and it's someone in goggles and a lab coat with an Erlenmeyer flask, test tubes, and presumably some form of open flame. Again, a clear core in chemistry. Biology is the forgotten child in this aspect, and especially the subset of biology that I'm often concerned with, zoology, and all of its derivatives. Whilst with very early sci-fi like Frankenstein, biology stood in part among its two brothers in science, with more modern and influential texts, it had somewhat fallen behind. Core texts that much of later sci-fi is built off, like Asimov's famous series that influenced much of robots in science fiction, Arthur C. Clarke, who influenced much of space travel in science fiction, and Robert A. Heinlein, who just sort of influenced most of science fiction full stop. There are other big seminal texts like the early work of Jules Verne and H.G. Wells, although those are perhaps debatable to some extent as to what genre they're in, but are all chiefly to do with chemistry or physics. That is, until Michael Crichton took pen to paper and plugged a modern sci-fi gap. As mentioned earlier, a lot of the most popular early sci-fi actually concerns itself with science. As one of the largest and most influential tentpoles of the genre, Star Wars is for all intents and purposes a space fantasy, but it has flashing lights and energy blasters, instead of spells and bows and arrows, so it's sci-fi. Thus, we find the first point of the split between hard and soft sci-fi. Hard sci-fi is generally sci-fi that tries its best to keep to the actual known laws of physics and reality, and to include as much reality as possible. It's not that it couldn't make up its own things, but much more that the things it did make up had to be as realistic as possible. So right now, in hard science fiction, if we want to travel to the moon and have the drama go down there, we absolutely can. We've already done that ages ago, just without the drama happening on the moon. If we want some fully functioning 50s sci-fi moon colony, we'd know that's a bit beyond our reach right now. But we may be able to have such a thing in the future if we have the technology that seems legit enough. So setting such a narrative in 2090 or something may not be too far. Hugo Gernsback goes as far to try and argue for science fiction versus science faction, the latter being what many would consider hard science fiction. A story so loaded with actual fact it's scarcely even making things up, and the few things it does make up are entirely plausible. When it comes to soft sci-fi, things can get a bit messier, with it being split into two schools of thought. One, and the one that arguably fits more with the base definition of hard sci-fi, is sci-fi less concerned with science itself, and more concerned with things like story and character. There can be sufficiently convincing technobabble, and much of the hallmarks of hard sci-fi, but really soft sci-fi is all about the story, and if it has to make things up a lot more and ignore reality and the laws of physics, then so be it. This is the side of the genre most are more in touch with. Naturally, it translates better to film and TV, and is often more dramatic and fast-paced, with Star Wars, Trek and Doctor Who all being soft sci-fi and the most well-known sci-fi. But some argue that soft sci-fi deals most literally with softer sci, and then fi, which is to say things like sociology and anthropology. This can run into some issues due to some disagreeing on what counts as soft or social science, as some natural sciences like geography can encompass both, and soft sciences like psychology can intertwine heavily with harder ones like neuroscience. And some seminal hard sci-fi can still focus on things like political science. So whilst this still can have some use, the relevance and strictness of science in the narrative is overall the better measuring stick. The informal big three of sci-fi, who as said influenced much of the genre, both hardest of the hard and softest of the soft, were Isaac Asimov, Arthur C. Clarke, and Robert A. Heinlein. The former is perhaps best known for his 3 laws in robotics, that many other stories have been formed around, but also his very maths-heavy Foundation series. Clarke has his own quoted trilogy about writing science fiction, and is best known for 2001: A Space Odyssey, later adapted into an equally seminal film, as was Heinlein's Starship Troopers, although as said, Heinlein's roots run through much of modern sci-fi. So space, physics, maths and engineering all have a very heavy focus in the founding pillars of science fiction. Biology and its derivatives were left out, and even with changing themes in science fiction, it still struggled to get in. New wave science fiction of the 60s, 70s and 80s brought about the cyberpunk genre, between Philip K. Dick's To Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, later adapted into a film called Blade Runner, and William Gibson's Neuromancer, and social sciences became much more involved through Ursula K. Le Guin's books that also delved things into more personal levels, with as big a focus on characters as concepts. So even the early new wave that tackled softer sciences and more soft sci-fi still struggled to include biology and its runoff. Crichton's first book only came out at the end of the 60s. So at this point it's worth asking, why was biology left out from the hallowed halls? And possibly because something else had already taken its place, which was Lost World fiction. Edgar Rice's Burroughs' Pellucidar series and other such texts, as well as Robert E. Howard's Conan the Barbarian, provided audiences with much of the sort of Victorian machete-slashing exploration vibes many expected from a genre about explorers. As it can't be ignored, early zoological and a lot of biological science was steeped in colonialism and such explorations, and probably wouldn't be described as a formal science until some time later. Much of said biological science wasn't based in ethology or ecology, or even genuine data collection, but just ascertaining what existed and where and then collecting it for museums. Natural history, as a field of science, is the grandfather of zoology, as well as some other branches, and the early collecting expeditions were for all intents and purposes represented in an exaggerated form in Lost World fiction. It wasn't until the 60s or later that zoological science matured, discovery science emerged in it, and the simple collection, classification and description actually evolved into the asking and answering of questions, either through careful manipulation or just long-term observation. Natural history also morphed into being the more accessible sci-com version of the earth sciences, not something you can really study anymore, but more a post-grad branch for the public, hence why museums of natural history exist, and why some documentary companies are called natural history units, making nature documentaries. So one could argue that if not biology, then zoology just hadn't really been created or matured at the same level as other formal sciences in the early 1900s, or even up to the 50s or 60s. It was running behind for people to actually get inspired by, and that niche had already been taken with other tales of exotic far-off lands, wild beasts, and inappropriate depictions of indigenous peoples. On top of this, even when it had matured, the earth sciences aren't exactly easy to write about in gripping narratives. Arguably the most well-known example of popular physics and engineering involved humanity going to the moon, and leaving our own planet is literally the bedrock of so much science fiction. And even without aliens or lasers, going up to the moon in a fiery superspeed rocket is pretty damn exciting. Perhaps the best known example of zoology was Tinbergen's 4 Questions, that he found from watching birds and bees. Televise that, and people probably aren't going to be gathering around their television screens announcing it as a giant leap for mankind. As Oppenheimer showed with its 115-minute build-up to them detonating the bomb, all science typically requires a lot of patience, observation, and number crunching to follow the data collection. But in chemistry and physics, the most exciting examples often end in some glowing lights that look pretty cool, and are pretty inspirational for fiction. Zoology doesn't really have an exciting conclusion in the same way. It's more just confirming what you'd suspected, or finding out that wasn't the case, and then explaining or theorizing on why. If anything, with exciting animals, the data collection is the exciting part, and then the write-up is the doldrum. And even exciting animals also sleep a lot if you're lucky enough to watch them in the field. The most exciting parts are arguably just individual data points, that themselves can't be a single study. Even with the most Hollywood-accessible biology, virology, the miraculous cure for the zombies or general supervirus or whatever pathogen is plaguing the narrative, is the end of the narrative, the conclusion, not the backbone for its continuation. So at press time, zoological science both had its niche stolen by its arguably more exciting and more problematic larval form, and just didn't lend itself to narratives as much as other sciences perhaps did. So how to fix that? For Crichton, he essentially mashed either the two tropes together, or different genres of science. Of Crichton's perhaps most famous novels, 5 of them deal heavily with topics in biology, but not just biology. As I mentioned in another video with the Andromeda strain, I do think Crichton singled biology out due to its current lack of prevalence in sci-fi. He openly mentions there's never been a biological crisis, and so fills that gap with his novel. Crichton in general seems to look for holes in the literature to plug with whatever was scaring him at the time, which was a lot. With Prey, it's a story about nanotech gone wrong. Initially developed to try and function as tiny molecular cameras for imaging technology, with possible medical applications, but is really something the military would be interested in. The nanobots were coded to behave like predators, using behavioural observations from assorted African carnivores, before being released into the wilds of the windy Nevada desert, so their AI would learn how to stick together in cohesive swarms. The nanobots' AI then got a bit too predatory and a bit too self-replicating, and became the archetypal grey goose swarm that's a common theme in science fiction. So the combined points are arguably both ethology and nanotechnology. Nanotechnology by itself isn't necessarily said to be bad. It's more giving it predatory AI, with well-meaning and, well, not necessarily wholesale evil intention, that causes it to become a problem. Also, the whole nanobots become human parasites too. Crichton's books can have somewhat ropey endings. In some cases, the biological side of things is played fairly straight, albeit with a twist. His first book, The Andromeda Strain, is styled essentially as a race against time in multiple stages, as Stone and co try to figure out what killed the town of Piedmont, how long they have before they too succumb to it, and if it can be cured. Happily for them, it turns out to be not too big of a problem, despite the initial blast of lethality. But the reader doesn't find that out until the end, obviously, and then the actual wildfire base starts trying to kill them by self-destructing when it realises the containment breach. The book is almost more a mix of Time Bomb and whodunit in regards to the alien virus, ultimately combining to make a solid thriller. In that respect, it's not an insult to describe Crichton's novels as pulpy. Many of the example texts in the opening paragraphs can be described as lofty. They're often, but not all, pretty high-concept, serious stories that wouldn't, for instance, lend themselves well to a blockbuster film. Books that are a lot more interesting than they are outwardly exciting. As said earlier, biology perhaps doesn't lend itself to dramatic conclusions either. So perhaps a faster pace, pulpier tone, and more action were needed to replace such conclusions with more action in the earlier stages of the books. After all, Crichton's novels do have a bit of a habit of having their finale at the end of the third quarter, and then sort of a long debrief for the final section, comprised of characters spelling out the science and remarking how that was crazy. Or of course a second, smaller and worse finale. When it comes to some other stories, Crichton quite deliberately blends the colonial and the modern, the best example perhaps being Congo. Congo was literally written as a modern interpretation of King Solomon's Mines, so it was a somewhat modernised tale about going into deepest, darkest Africa, with someone who can talk to animals, which was a reference to King Solomon's ring, that apparently gave that ability. In Congo, the trip is to acquire the resource of Type 2B diamonds for Silicon Valley projects. But animals and the communication with them are a key part of the novel. Amy the gorilla, who joins the trek, is heavily based off Coco, who we now unfortunately know to be a bit of a sham, but at the time was a pretty big revelation in primatology. As well as Amy's role in things, there are the grey gorillas too, gorilla hybrids believed to have been selectively bred as guard dogs by a past civilization that survived past their owners and have since turned feral, but remain immensely hostile to human outsiders. Using mixed recordings from Amy, they managed to speak to the grey gorillas to keep their nightly assaults at bay. So it's something of a grounded scientific spin on the original idea of speaking to animals, with current beliefs in primatology. Aspects of the zoological are also still prevalent in other areas. There's plenty set dressing with descriptions of wildlife in Central Africa, and a few action sequences such as the hippo boat chapter too. Whilst the subset of biology used is primatology, Crichton does occasionally bring up shifting beliefs in animals with the rise of zoological science, referring to studies on animals like wolves and hyenas. Crichton's struggle to end things succinctly does lead to some iffiness though, and despite being filled with grey gorilla attacks and concluding with a volcanic eruption, Crichton still felt the need to tack on a tribal attack in the 11th hour that ends with them shooting the headman. Probably one aspect of the original explanation stories that could have been left out. And in some ways, it might well just be that some aspects of the colonial are partly inescapable in some aspects of zoological science fiction. Because the colonial era of discovery essentially undergoes a second era, when humanity finds something new to colonize. Upon discovering an alien planet full of life or islands of dinosaurs, the first port of call both in and out of the book is discovery, literally the identifying of what's what. It would be difficult to imbibe the narrative with prevalent aspects of their ecology and behaviour when you've only just discovered they exist. Congo gets away with this, as gorillas are a species most people know about, as are indeed most large African mammals, and Coco was and still is a very well-known case study. But overall, first you need to know what they are, and then you can go for more of a deep dive. This is sort of how the two Jurassic Park novels go. If you were to watch the first Jurassic Park film and then hear it was based on a book, the Lost World book is probably a lot closer to what most people would envisage. The strong aspects of the dinosaur renaissance and their plot relevance were much more baked into the rewrite between Kep and Crichton for the Spielberg film. The original novel is much more about genetic engineering mostly, and chaos theory to a lesser degree, that then also happens to have a few dinosaur action sequences thrown in too. It's much more a setup for the surrounding conditions of creating dinosaurs, and the consequences of such actions. The dinosaurs themselves are much more just a part of the set piece. They're not really explored in great depth. It's in the Lost World where dinosaur ecology and behaviour come to the forefront much more. Gone are most of the clinical labs and tourist lodges, with the bulk of the dinosaur action now happening out in the field. Dinosaur behaviour is repeatedly a stressed point in the plot, and the actions of the characters. Levine scoffs at Thorne's overzealous rescue, claiming they were never in any danger past a certain point, as the bull Rex would never stray too far from the nest. Basilton is eaten by said Rex later for wrongly believing they can only see moving objects. The raptors are now like Pilansberg's elephants, snappy, sloppy and unstable, as they maul each other to death regularly and struggle to raise their offspring, all because they were social animals improperly raised, due to the prion killing the mature individuals in the groups. The chameleon Carnotaurus aren't defeated with a rocket launcher or poisoned eggs, but shifting the ambient light too quickly for them to change, so they become uncomfortable and leave. The scent of the invisible predators in the Staff village also makes the other carnivores uncomfortable, hence why it becomes a temporary haven. A lot of this comes from Crichton being directly influenced by ethologists and their stories. Incidents like the Pachycephalosaurus surrounding characters hiding under the trucks, or the Tyrannosaurus doing the same, are adapted straight from similar stories of buffalo and hyenas from the Serengeti. Sarah Harding is clearly partially based on Hans Krug, with her studies of hyenas, which was one of the studies referenced in Prey for the Pred-Prey code for the nanobots, with her chapter opening with a description of Harding in the field watching a successful hunt. So overall, the spirit of ethology and dinosaur behaviour being a key factor in the novel events is much stronger in the second book than the first. The Lost World is indeed a reference to the original Conan Doyle book, And is also Crichton finally shrugging off the last of the bad original aspects of colonial tropes for a more modern take on the explorative adventure novel? The island is uninhabited, so the characters aren't colonising other civilizations. Technobabble is gone and replaced with ethology and ecology, but there's still plenty tense action and pulp thrills. Despite the poor critical reception it received on release, I do think The Lost World may be one of Crichton's best balanced books in this regard. But then 2 of the characters are literally nerd scientists, so maybe it appealed to me a lot anyway. But if nothing else, it hopefully shows how Crichton brought biology from colonial roots into more contemporary sci-fi literature. Since then, more have adapted core aspects of biology into both hard and soft sci-fi. I've done a lot of yappery on Max Brooks's books, in case you haven't noticed, and in big-budget Hollywood films, you can argue Avatar goes pretty full-on for the ecology, and to a lesser extent animal behaviour for some key points. 10 years after the Andromeda Strain, Alien was made, which, if being watched by Kang and Kodos on their ship, would have just come across as a weirdly dramatised xenomorph nature documentary. It's only horror as we're the species that's host and prey. So perhaps horror has never had the same reticence as contemporary sci-fi when embracing the natural world, perhaps as it can just be scary to some. There's more I plan to say in this genre too in the distant future, and let us hope for plenty more biological sci-fi too. Thanks for watching. And as ever, a huge thanks to my patrons: Toxic Wolf, The Superest Duper, Sam Burgo, K. Sandom, Octavia of the Fifth Fleet, Nickname 3110, Erengar Steiny, Kieran McCarthy, Flygon's Archives, Hui Hui, Jabin, The Belted Horned Warbler, Nathan Cross, Tim Gojira, Dapperaptor, Bonecrusher Hyena, Godzilla Prime 2, Original Username, Evilly, Howleth, Archosaur Queen, Tommy Choi, Jacob Wilcox, Seth Fake Last Name, Zacer, Dodecablos, and Bazugazu Bakumatsu, whose generosity helps keep the channel going. As the world turns on its axis, every time I make a new Michael Crichton related video, I think it'll be the last. Yet here we are. I do actually quite like discussing broader aspects in science fiction, and trying to place a bit more emphasis on the sci than the fi, as I do have another video or 2 in this ilk planned. I try to focus on the larger and more prevalent aspects in science fiction here, but I am only one person and I haven't read every book ever. So if you think there's some major biological sci-fi that I've missed out, please do let me know in the comments, or if you think there are some more modern series that I should know about. One thing that was brought up last time when I talked about Michael Crichton was his quite notable views on climate change. Crichton is far from a perfect writer, both overall and with how he handles science occasionally, but in his most recent video, I think Cold Crash Productions goes over this topic pretty well, and I'd recommend watching his video on that. Anyway, for next time, another Spec Evo short. Or not if I don't finish it in time. We'll have to see.